Good morning, everybody. My name is Gary Steinburg, and I am affiliated with CMTC, which is California's Manufacturing Technology Consulting. We are a nonprofit, and we are funded by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. We are going to cover um, supply chain disruption, mitigation, and go through what we consider like what are the risks and challenges in supply chain today. Obviously, how has the pandemic impacted our supply chain? And go through some cause and effects, look at some of the risks and drivers in the supply chain. And I'm going to finish up by providing a couple of different tools that can be utilized as we all assess our supply chains, and just finish up with a call to action. So we're pretty informal. We have a very small group today, and again, encourage questions. And if we can, during the presentation, we'll take those questions and we can create somewhat of a dialogue through the webinar. So with that, I'm just going to get started. Um, and I think the first thing that is critical is that I pulled some information as we go through this from Essentia. So I have pulled some information from other sources. Uh, Essentia took a survey right as the COVID-19 started back in the March, April timeframe. And they published this report, basically the results of the survey. And we saw some pretty dramatic impacts from COVID. And you can look at those numbers, they're pretty startling. So starting out, we see that 94% of Fortune 100 companies were seeing supply chain disruptions from COVID-19. Also, the results from the survey indicated 75% of the companies have had a negative or strongly negative impact on their business. And I think the number that kind of surprised me, that 55% of the companies plan to downgrade their growth plans and outlooks. So, you know, to me, I don't necessarily agree with, the downgrade in growth outlooks, because as we have come through the pandemic, we've seen a lot of companies actually flourish during the pandemic. And obviously the impact that we've seen or we've experienced are companies that, you know, are in the industries like retail, like, hospitality, restaurants, all the things that are socially active industries. Those impacts have been real and certainly have been impacted dramatically. Um, so let's get into talking a little bit about supply chain risks and challenges. Um, I think before I get started, I'm sure some of you, most of you are familiar with supply chain, what supply chain means, but I think one of the keys in supply chains, I think we have to, keep in mind is that I personally, have worked in supply chain management, engineering, manufacturing for, I hate to admit, over 40 years. Um, but supply chain over the years, it's become so interrelated. It's like I kind of a good example is that the linkages in supply chain are so critical to the success of a company. And a simple example, and I think one that everyone's familiar with, is, let's say, for example, sales. We see some sales. Supply chain, we call that demand. So we interpret demand, we see an increase or a decrease in demand. Well, think of, links in a chain. Well, how does that impact the supply chain? We're here today talking about risk mitigation. So let's talk about the downside first. So if we see a lowering in demand, that impact, and if we just go all the way to the end, basically that has a huge impact on revenues, sales and revenue. And then the other impact, which is a little bit more subtle, is suddenly you're seeing some increases in inventory. And I think the main concern for a lot of companies, hey, how long am I going to hold that inventory? How does that going to impact my balance sheet, my cash flow? So as you can see, supply chain has so many inner links and how successful we can be as a company, and it drives success, for the company. And on the downside, how do we, I would say, ratchet back our supply chain so we can be flexible for downsides or upsides in our business. So let's look at some of the risks that are inherent. And supply chain, again, when I look at supply chains, I always think in terms of long term. We can always, say change a supplier. We can always look for better pricing, but because of all the interrelations within the supply chain, I think we all have to be looking at the long term for supply chains. So some of these risks and challenges, keep in mind, how do they impact the company and success of the company? So many supply chains, they lack global resilience. They're breaking down in the face of multi-country disruptions. So disruptions mean political disruptions, things of that nature. And certainly because of disruption and what we're seeing in the global supply chains, and we're seeing like China, Far East become more expensive, we're seeing that supply chain and operations are becoming more costly. So, when we move supply chains and we're all, we all want to buy American, buy US, and we call this reshoring our supply chains domestically. This is really having an impact on our costs. So as we can see, and as we've talked about the importance of supply chains often represent a company's highest costs within the company. So again, as successful as supply chain means more success for the company. And this tends to lead to this significant impacts that supply chains are not meeting stakeholders' expectations for sustainability. So that would mean like shareholders, stockholders, executive management, board members would be the stakeholders for a company. And again, this lack of flexibility inhibits the ability to address customer demand. So again, and we'll get into some examples, but when we see one of our suppliers not able to meet our demand, that has a tremendous impact on meeting our customer orders. So let's move into talking. Do we have any questions, Sabrina, at this point?
So far, there are no questions in the chat.
Thank you. So let's look at some what we call supply chain disruptions, and this would be cause and effect. So a couple that I would really focus in on is disruptions. So if you look at this, and these obviously these are a lot of what I call self-explanatory. We see a supplier shut down a factory for an extended period of time. Huge disruption. We have internally within our own manufacturing, we have key plants that shut down for an extended period of time, or we see customer-related causes or effects. Demand increases by 20% or decreases by 20% or more. And also, what I see is down in information processing. This one has a tremendous impact when we see suppliers increase their minimum order sizes, whatever, 20%, 100%. Think about how that impacts us, the company when we order. So suddenly, if the MOQ increases, we're having to increase our order sizes, but yet we're decreasing the frequency in which we order. So again, that comes back to how does that work and how does that impact, flexibility in the supply chain and meeting our customer demands. And suddenly, like we're mentioning, this whole impact, the linkages. So suddenly we start to see customers that may begin to order like twice as much in their order sizes and less frequently. And this, again, I call it maybe a domino effect, but all this linkage. And for those of you who are familiar with SIOP, starting with sales, forecasting, all that, when we see less frequent orders and changes in demand by our customers, that has a tremendous impact on forecasting, which then trickles down to how we in the supply chain, order from our suppliers. So, there's a huge impact there. And as we're all sensitive, in the procurement area, we all understand costs. So, we see supplier cost increases, we see transportation cost increases. How does this impact, us in the company? Well, certainly a couple of ways. One here, we have an internal cash flow. Suddenly we have to start delaying payments to customers. And certainly on the customer side, I would say, well, we start seeing these supply and parts increases. Eventually, we're going to have to increase prices to continue to meet the margin goals that we have for the company. So certainly that is a key. We're going to move into what we consider the risks in the supply chain. And again, let's talk disruptions. How can a supply chain become disrupted? I don't know if you've experienced, but suppliers going out of business, suddenly they're bankrupt. They can't supply the materials that you ordered. We've got these, war and terrorism, these political issues. And then I think a very realistic one is we often have a dependency on a single source of supply. So, and I kind of relate this to when we start looking at our bills of material, we look at, how we manufacture our product. What are those critical parts? What are those A items? What are those custom parts? And in all those categories, do we have only a single source of supply? It's a question we all have to ask ourselves. And that's something that, we need to understand that is what I call a pain point or a risk factor in our supply chain. We look at delays. Delays can be a number of things. Delays meaning the simple one for me is that, our suppliers aren't delivering. That's obviously a very obvious delay. But then you have some subtle delays. Poor quality results in you may not have your orders fulfilled as expected, or you receive material that you actually, provide to your manufacturing line. Suddenly you realize, that component does not meet your quality requirements. You have to stop the line. You have to, get other product and hopefully have other product available. So all of these, certainly cause a delay in delivering your product to your customers. And then if you are in a situation where you use, SIOP, you utilize your forecast as you create demands out there for ordering product, components, and materials. What happens when you have an inaccurate forecast? Because if you have long lead times and you don't have the right forecast, you don't place the right demand and place the right orders to your suppliers. Well, it's hard. Your supply chain in that case is slow to react. not flexible, and again, has a huge impact on meeting your customer orders. And then another one that is I see as a critical one that's not often talked about is, do you have artificial demands that are causing product shortages? So meaning, you have a forecast that's not realistic, so you place orders that are higher than required, and suddenly you have product shortages because your suppliers can't fulfill your orders. So that's certainly an area that is of concern. And I think one that's critical when we talk about supply chain risks, capacity. Capacity can be very expensive, and we look at capacity in two ways. We look at internal capacity on your manufacturing lines. If you have critical operations that in order to meet demand, you have to make those investments. It may be, a machine capital intensive area. It's costs a lot, a lot of capital to make those investments, and also having capacity flexibility so that, again, when you have suppliers that say reach 100% of their capacity, do they have a method or do they have a strategy to offload that capacity? Do they have subcontractors? Do they have other facilities? How can they meet those capacity requirements? So now that we've kind of talked about all the risks, all the issues, what can we do within our supply chains? How can we really attack, looking at the risks that we have? How do we do some mitigation actions? And I would say there's a couple of tools that are very important. The one I like to talk about first, and this one's, I think, probably the most logical, is for within your supply chain is take a bill of material. Take a bill of material and focus in on your key components. And typically, this is the most comprehensive approach. So what I would recommend is, for example, a company take the top 5, products that the highest product sales. So take those, take a bill of material, take a drill down into the different levels within the supply chain, and look at what those critical, component suppliers, raw material suppliers, and again, analyze as many tiers as you can that's, realistic, to kind of look at those hidden suppliers and understand where there's, risks. There's like, single sources of supply, sole sourcing, high costs of material. And again, looking at, what do we do in terms of what actions can we do? And we kind of drive this through what we call contingency planning. So, we look at like the primary, what are the site activities performed to the supplier? And as I mentioned before, if a supplier hits a ceiling on capacity, do they have an outlet to, supplement that capacity? Can they meet your order expectations? And do they have a what I call plan method if they hit that ceiling that can still meet your order levels? And looking at suppliers, do they have alternate sites? So kind of follows the same theme on capacity. Do they have other sites where they can share orders, they can share demands? Can they, again, not only use subcontractors and other suppliers, but also within their enterprise, can they offload orders to meet your demands? And then also when a supplier does have alternate sites, how long will it take them to get that capacity up, running, available to be able to ship to you? So I don't have a specific example, but I think, it's pretty straightforward on, using this tool. We call it a mapping tool. And we just kind of go through the bills of material, and it's a very valuable exercise. And I think for me, the way I would do this would be to actually kind of map it out, almost like a flow chart, and take those critical components and just look at the supply chain on those components, and how far down you can bring that, in the steps within the supply chain, from, ordering the product, to the supplier, to the supplier site. Do they have alternate sites, et cetera, how they actually, um, obtain their raw materials. I mean, it could branch out pretty dramatically. And I think from there, when you visually look at these maps, you can really, evaluate and understand where some of the weak points are in those particular supply chains. Another tool that can be used, and this one's a lot more sophisticated, and this one I borrowed from the supply chain media, and this was from last year, but this one is for what I would consider a more mature supply chain. And you look at different categories within the supply chain. We're looking at strategic, we're looking at tactical, and then we're looking at, the operational, I would say, disciplines within the supply chain. And we go from, the suppliers to internal, meeting within our own company. And then we go to the downstream, we call channels, we call customers, and that would be anything from warehousing, and the impact from supply chain. And you can see it's definitely it's a scoring, it's a scorecard, and you're just going to go through each one of these. And again, I think this particular tool is really, I think, more focused on the largest supply chain, because there's a lot of sophisticated categories when they go through this. Do you have, dynamic, take one, for example, do you have inbound transport planning? Do you have real-time alerts for traffic jams? I'm just going down into the operational. So these get pretty sophisticated. Certainly when you're a small, medium-sized company, it would be tremendous if you could actually go through a tool like this. But again, that would be probably not realistic. But it's something that you can kind of create your own self-assessment tool and use some of these categories, and the questions you would ask would probably just be a simpler format. So taking these tools, where do we start with mitigation? What are the actions that we should be taking as we actually utilize some of these tools? So kind of looking at, how do we execute a plan? So first we need to, we call it mobilization. We kind of just established that we're going to mobilize. We establish rules, how we're going to, again, review the supply chain and look at contingencies. And then we kind of, again, from our self-assessments, from our tools, we kind of then look at, hey, where do we have our risk? Where do we start prioritizing? And then from there, we go down to analysis. So what do we look at in terms of, I call it the brainstorming? What are the scenarios? What are we looking to change? What do we, if we do something, what are the implications? And then from there, we kind of develop, the action. We configure, we kind of look, we go out there, we kind of do an exercise and those changes that we would like to make. And then we kind of, in effect, we track the success and measure the impact. So visually, we kind of look at that as kind of the wheel, you know, starting to end point. But let's look at some of the specifics. I mean, these are the, you know, what are the activities? What are some of the actions we look at? What are the categories? So, you know, the categories, for example, they're really all meant to really reduce risks in the supply chain. So, you know, we could look at some of these, all of these, a combination, but, you know, increasing capacity, you know, focus on low cost decentralization for predictable demand. So, you know, we have a predictable demand in a product, constant, you know, I think the theme you're going to see throughout these mitigations, higher demand, predictable demand. Yes, we can drive cost reduction. We don't have to look as much in the flexibility in the supply chain, but, you know, so again, we drive um, actions based on predictable, variable demand, commodity product. I mean, that's kind of how I would categorize the different um, types of demand within the supply chain. Um, Transitioning to redundant suppliers. So again, the whole idea of utilizing redundant suppliers for high volume parts and less redundancy for lower volume parts. So um, redundant suppliers meaning, hey, second sourcing, right? Not relying on a single source. Um, Less redundancy for lower parts, volume parts. So again, more suppliers, less redundancy, you know, again, reducing our risks. Um, Increased responsiveness. Okay, again, prioritize costs over responsiveness for commodity products. Commodity products. Okay, I know it's simple. I always say nuts, bolts, you know, things that you can buy that are already basically buying through a distributor. The common parts, you can buy them at, you know, supplier A in your town, supplier B 100 miles away. You know, that's kind of what I would consider, you know, commodity product. Um, and again, um, prioritize responsiveness for short life cycle products. So self-explanatory there. Um, Inventory, I think inventory is something that supply chain has a lot of responsibility in inventory balances, inventory turns, you know, cost of inventory. So again, decentralized inventory of predictable lower value parts. So um, again, a large enterprise, decentralizing means have inventory in a lot of different locations, you know, so pretty straightforward. Yeah, one big one is flexibility. You know, prioritize cost over flexibility for predictable high volume parts. And it certainly would be the reverse for low volume, you know, with what's we state here is uneven demand. So, you know, we want our supply chains to be flexible, but yet we need them to be cost effective. So we do have a balance. And again, on capacity, we prefer, you know, capability over cost for high value, high risk parts. Again, we need that supplier that delivers quality product, has, you know, the technical capability, and we cannot take the risk that we move that particular product to a lower cost supplier if we have any questions or any, let's say, thought of a risk of poor quality, poor delivery. So, you know, necessarily we have to respect capability, and many times we have to pay. We have to pay for that. So just again, we just need to be focused on the risks in the supply chain. Okay, so where does this all leave us? So, you know, we've talked through all the risks, some of the mitigation actions, some of the tools, you know, here's a call to action. Where do we start? What do we need to do? And I think for those here on the webinar today, ask yourself the question, do I really understand my supply chain? So what does that mean to me? Where's the starting point? So the starting point for me is to develop a baseline. And this is understanding exactly where you are with your demand, inventory capacity, your cost, and your customer experience. So, and this is all across the company. So understanding everything, because at the start of the webinar, critical point of supply chain, we impact everything related to demand, inventory, costs, and the customer experience. So we need to understand exactly our starting point when we start to look at any changes and actions within the supply chain. Second thing is build a team that's going to support any execution, any changes, and looking at how we can make changes, but changes in what I call in a responsible way. And that's when we mention this as a sales and ops SWAT team. So this is taking the traditional sales and inventory and operations planning team approach, because we know that we not only have the operations within the company, but we also have the impact to the sales side, forecast, and on the outcome is the customer. So we need to bring sales into these activities and these teams as well, because whatever actions you take in the supply chain, that's going to have a tremendous impact with our customers. And the next, as part of this, is running some scenarios. In other words, when I have an idea, take it through, and I want to create a plan, run this scenario through a simulation. Where's the impact? How's that going to be actionable? And will this immediately, or will this impact our operational results and our metrics? So and then once we have those scenarios, before we implement, we also need to consider developing contingency plans. So whenever we make a change, we have to understand where the risks are, where our pain points are, and understand that whatever changes we make, whatever actions we take, ensure that we have a contingency plan. And last is, whenever we make changes, we have to understand the impact. So as we started out, we have a baseline, understand once we've made those changes, how have we impacted the baseline, all, the company, everything from demand, customers, costs, and meeting our on-time delivery. And again, when we make those changes, we just measure the impact and hopefully successes that drive the changes that you have recommended and have implemented. So that pretty much concludes our webinar for today. I'd be very happy, Sabrina, to take any questions that we have in the chat room.
Okay, great. So one question we have here, the participant is asking, when MOQ increases and warehouse space is already impacted, are there unique ways or options to find more space without breaking the bank? So staying within that budget there.
Great question. So in my experience, when we got into that type of situation, there's a couple ways that I would suggest on when we see MOQs increasing and we have large amounts of inventory. We have to understand, is this going to be sustainable over a long period of time, or is this a short-term issue? Two ways that I look at that. My approach would be approach the supplier. Can they hold that inventory before they ship it in their warehouse? That would be one approach. The second approach that I have actually used in my career, I've used offsite warehousing. Typically, if everyone's familiar with 3PLs, a 3PL situation, and what they do is they usually charge you by the pallet. They charge you whatever, for example, $5 a pallet per month to store their material, your material. So if you have a relationship with a 3PL, that is one, approach to the problem. On the other side, you can approach your supplier and see if they can hold that inventory for you for a period of time. Maybe it's 90 days, whatever. So it's a couple of approaches that I would definitely investigate.
Great. Also, this isn't necessarily a question, but if you could share the link for that specific tool that was shared in slide 8.
Okay. I'll have to look. Yeah.
The self-assessment tool.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can send that over to us, and when we share the presentation, we can send that out to the attendees.
Okay. And it's supply chain media from February 2020. So I'll find that and send it over to you.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And then the last question here in the chat box, how long should we expect supply delays as a result of the vaccine rollout?
Ooh, that's a tough question.
Hot topic, COVID, vaccine.
Yeah. I would have to be off the record on this. I have no, I have no good resources to really give me a good answer for that question. So it's very difficult for me to answer that question in a professional way. So no, I'll take a pass on that one for now. So yeah, just can't take that question.
Fair enough. Okay, so those were the responses there in the chat. As I said earlier, we'll go ahead and share this recording with all of the attendees, and we'll include your information as well, Gary.
Okay, that's good. And I have that up here now. And again, just a little infomercial. So CMTC, offers services in supply chain. So if there's ever any question, or please contact me directly, and we can get you to the right source. And again, since we are a nonprofit consulting firm, we do offer a lot of services that are complementary, and we're subsidized by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So we welcome any questions, or if you have anything you'd like to discuss, I'd be more than happy to take a few minutes. So I want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you for your time today. And Sabrina, thank you for hosting us.
Well, thank you for being here, Gary. We do appreciate it.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good one.
You too. Have a nice day.